Tonight is the 10th of Shvat. It's the yard side of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. And a year later, in 1951, the same date, his son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem M Schneerson, the Rebbe, assumed the leadership and accepted the leadership of Chabad. And since then, the growth of the Chabad community and impact in the world has been tremendous. So tonight's class is dedicated to the Rebbe. And the topic is going to be something very relevant, the idea of Jewish leadership. And particularly because it also is on the Parshat that we're reading this week. So let's begin. L'chaim.
L'chaim.
So I just want to start off with a little thought exercise. I want you to take a second and think in your mind who is or was in your minds in recent history, let's say, the greatest leader, person with who had the most influence.
How far back?
Yeah, the truth is, as far as you want. But let's try in more recent history, someone who had the most influence.
David Ben Gurion.
Okay. You don't have to say.
I thought we were supposed
no,
to.
just think about it.
Oh.
And now I want you to think about, in a more personal way, who has had the most influence on you. So it could be someone you've met and know well, could be an author, a historical figure, someone who has had the largest impact on your life.
Are you talking Jewish or just in general?
General. If you can pinpoint a person that has had the largest impact on your life. Raise your hand if those two are the same people. No, right? I wasn't expecting it. Now, but more telling than that, how would you, the person who had the greatest influence, what would you describe as their role? Their influence in what capacity? Media personality,
We
okay.
talk about like the Jewish leader.
Doesn't need to be Jewish.
I'm a little confused. You asked us first who's the most outstanding Jewish leader.
No, so again,
Or did I
the first
misunderstand
question,
you?
who is the person who had the greatest influence?
That was the second question you asked. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I'm a lawyer. I'm gonna say.
I know. The first question was a universal question. Which person has had the greatest influence? Period.
Okay.
The second question is who has had the greatest influence on you?
I thought you said Jewish, but okay. All right.
So, the first, a media personality. What else? What other roles? President.
I would say a thought leader.
A thought leader, okay.
And being able to make palatable or receptive a very, very deep intellectual and soulful knowledge, making it so that the masses could receive it, that it's not aloof, so it's a bridge.
So about bridges.
A bridge of really deep, soulful, but without being too aloof, that it just stays in the clouds, and I think reaches everybody.
Okay.
And mine was the Rebbe, by the way. I'll just let you know that was my first,
Okay.
the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
There are people you could describe that who had very negative effects on the human race, who were leaders, who could espouse things,
Well, influence can be positive or negative,
Oh.
right?
And I was saying soulful, so I'm sort of inclined towards the lighter
Goodness,
side of it.
the
Yeah,
goodness.
because you can go.
Yeah,
The
you
person who could
Hitler.
bring the light could bring the dark. Yeah.
So the second person, what would you describe their role? Their impact was in what capacity?
Oh, from whom I got values and basically how I was going to lead my life.
So in what capacity did they influence you?
By example.
By example, okay.
And by teaching, but also by example.
Caregiver.
Caregiver.
Right.
Someone who has your back.
So, what I hope to bring out through this little exercise is that when we think of leadership, we tend to think of the first. We think of a global leader, someone in power, it's a president, someone with immense influence, like a media personality, someone who has strength backing them up. That person can have the greatest impact. And when we think of leadership, that's what we tend to usually think of. That's the model of leadership that we naturally are drawn towards. But when we think about it on a personal level, who's had an impact on me, which means who in my life has been a leader for me, someone who's guided me, we tend to think of it very differently. It's a teacher, someone who's a role model, someone who gives love, care. So it's a very different perspective we're having on a leader. And that person doesn't necessarily have to be considered by the world to be a leader, right? It could be the person who had the most impact on my life is unknown to the world. But in my life, he or she is a leader. They have led me to where I am, right? So when we think about leadership, and especially from a Jewish perspective, we tend to opt for the second option. That a leader is not just someone who can herd the sheep and get everyone in the right direction and force an agenda on the public, but it's someone who has care for the individual, someone who's able to guide each person to the place they need to go, someone who recognizes on a very personal level each person what they need and give to the individuals room to grow. The first Jewish leader, who is the quintessential Jewish leader, is Moshe. And what's fascinating is the name he has come to be known stems from the Torah. How do we describe Moshe? Rabbeinu. We don't say Moshe the miracle worker. Moshe he was a statesman, right? He convinced Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go. Moshe, the prophet. He was the greatest prophet who ever lived. Those are all true. And they all describe something unique about Moshe. But at the end of the day, what do we describe about his leadership that's unique? How do we, the Jewish people, look at Moshe? Moshe, our teacher. Fascinating. A teacher. Look, how many school teachers do you know? Teachers are common, right? Doesn't seem unique. You go through school, you have 10, 20 teachers, 30, 40. So a teacher isn't something unique yet. What's the greatest value we ascribe to Moshe? He was a teacher. So what does it mean to be a teacher to this degree? Obviously, it's not just a classroom teacher. Something greater about what Moshe taught and how he taught it and what it means that he taught the Jewish people. So let's look at this week's Torah portion, and I think that something, the narrative of the portion will give us a perspective. The Jews are out of Egypt, and they're on their way to freedom. And you can put yourself in their shoes for a moment. This is hundreds of years of slavery, of a people being oppressed under the Egyptian slave masters. And finally they have this ray of hope. Moses comes, but that's dashed when Pharaoh knocks him away. And a year, there's been this ongoing process of plagues where there's hope to go free and Pharaoh changes his mind, the tension, and a real emotional roller coaster for the Jewish people. Finally, Pharaoh says, you can go. And they had their matzahs, and they ate their paschal lambs. There's a real air of freedom, of celebration. It's not even a week later, and that all comes crashing down. In front of them is the sea, the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. They have nowhere to go. Behind them is the Egyptian army chasing them. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's nothing to do. And as quick as their celebration was, as excited they were, that's how fast they're losing everything. And there was real indecision amongst the Jews what they should do now. The Midrash describes 4 camps, 4 groups of Jews. One said, let's go back to Egypt. That's it. At least we were alive then. You know, being oppressed, being slaves, at least you've got food on your table. The second group said, let's give up. Jump into the ocean, take our lives. At least the Egyptians shouldn't be the ones to kill us. Give up all hope. The third group says, pray to God. We have nothing else to do. Just pray. And the fourth group said, let's go to war. Try our luck, battle the Egyptians. So none of them knew what to do. They came to Moses. Moses didn't either know what to do. So he turns to God. And God looks at Moses and says, what are you asking me? Why are you reaching out to me? Why are you wasting your time praying to me? Just go. And basically God was telling him, I took you out of Egypt, right? I told you to travel to Sinai. Have faith. Keep traveling. You see a sea in front of you. Who cares? Just go. And there was one Jew who had enough faith and said, okay, God says to go, we're going to go. His name was Nachshon. Nachshon, the son of Aminadav. He went and he starts going in the water ankle deep, gets to his knee deep, to his thighs. You know, can you imagine there's the whole Jewish people watching this crazy fanatic. And he keeps going up to his, as he gets up to his neck, that's when the water split. And the Jewish people collectively experience perhaps the greatest miracle in our history. That a sea just split open and revealed dry land, a path for the Jewish people to go through. And of course, we know the rest of the story. They get out safely. As the Egyptians come chasing them, suddenly the waters come crashing down, drowning the Egyptians, and the Jews are free to continue their travel to Sinai. The experience at the splitting of the sea wasn't just an incredible visual experience. Wow, look at that, water standing up, water splitting. But our tradition has it that the prophetic experience that every Jew had then was greater than even the greatest of prophets. There was this collective epiphany that the Jewish people just saw the divine, experienced God in such a deep and real way that has never repeated itself. And so as much as it was a splitting of the physical sea, the Zohar in Kabbalah, it says it was a splitting also of the spiritual seas. That is, that we live in a world which is murky waters. We don't see truth. And splitting of the sea is opening up our eyes to reality that we're not usually privy to. And so when they were going on the dry land, they were experiencing everything in an open way. A trippy experience. They were just seeing things differently. And what was their reaction? As soon as the Jews crossed the sea, it says they broke out in song.
Elation.
That's the way to express such joy, such deep spirituality. The way to express it is in song. And this song has been recorded in Torah, and it actually is part of our daily prayers. Yes, within that song, it's a long song. Starts Az Yashir Moshe V'nei Yisrael. Then Moses and the Jewish people began to sing. They said, thanks to God for the miracles. They describe the miracles. Part of that is Mi Kamocha, the famous line, who is like you, God? And goes to describe the fear that the whole world then had of the Jews because of what had happened at the splitting of the sea. And eventually the end of the song is how God's presence that they experienced then will be manifest eventually in a temple in the Beis HaMikdash. So they had this incredible experience of singing. The Talmud asks in Yiddish the term a klutz kasha, which means a very basic, simple question that seems silly, but actually breaks apart the whole story. And that is, how did this song work? There were millions of people, right? We know the census was 600,000 males between 20 and 60, which makes it from 2 to 3 million people probably there. Who composed the song? Who taught it to them? How they all instantly know this song and burst out? Was it planned? Pre-rehearsed? How did that singing work? Any ideas?
People's mic.
Sorry? People's mic?
People's mic.
I didn't hear that, huh?
The people's mic.
The people's smartphone.
Oh, the people.
They downloaded it.
I thought it was Moses' wife that came up with it. That's some tradition I heard.
Moses' wife? Okay.
That's what I heard. She came up with the words.
Moses' sister led the singing.
Or maybe
women.
his sister, not the wife. I'm my yeah.
Maybe when something is that visible and experienced by everybody at once, that's the song. You know it. It's in front of you. It's your experience, and everyone that crossed experienced it. So that song comes with that.
So the song was a natural reaction, and
Yeah.
since they had the same experience, they had the same reactions. Okay? So there's 2 clues in the text. One clue is that it says, Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Yisrael. Then Moses and the Jewish people began to sing. Now, Moses was one of the Jews. So why did it say, then the Jewish people began to sing? Why is Moses singled out? Moses and the Jewish people began to sing. That's one hint in the text. The second is, it says, Vayomru Lamer. They began to sing and they said, saying, which almost, Lamer usually is meant to repeat. Right? Throughout the Torah it says God spoke to Moses saying, which means God told Moses to repeat to the Jews. So the word saying means, I want you to say this over. If everyone's saying it, who is repeating it? So these 2 clues in the text lead us to the answer. But like every Jewish question, especially in the Talmud, it's more than one answer, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions.
Right.
And the Talmud has 3 opinions about what happened and how this worked. And they run an entire gamut. The first opinion says that really the Jewish people didn't sing any song. Moses sang the song. And they just had this little phrase, which was the beginning of the song, Ashir Allah Hashem. And every stanza that Moshe said, they repeated Ashir Allah Hashem. We're going to praise God. Like, sometimes in shul, in the synagogue, we have the same thing. The chazan singing, and we throw in a word here and there. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to know the songs, the words. There's one phrase that they kept repeating. So Moses said a phrase, they said 2 words. Moses said a phrase, they said again, Asher Hashem, Asher Hashem. That's opinion number 1. Opinion number 2 says, Moshe said each stanza. So again, Moshe is delineated because he said it, and they repeated it word after word from him. Was Mike. There you go. You went off. And the third opinion, this is what Pete said, is that Moshe started it off, the first few words, but then all the Jewish people just had an inspiration, an inspired singing, and they all sang the exact same words together. Now, this is a great debate, interesting topic. None of the rabbis who were discussing this were there, right? And it almost seems irrelevant. Who cares exactly how the Jewish people thousands of years ago sang after the splitting of the sea? But not only did the rabbis deem it worthy of discussing and spending their time on, the Talmud deemed it worthy of recording. So there must be something in this debate that's more than just meets the eye. Fascinating, if you studied Talmud before, there's usually very little detail given as to the actual setting of these discussions, right? So we know from little hints and pieces of information here and there, we get a picture of how their studies worked, and how their yeshivas worked in the days of the Talmud, how the sages, how often they'd come to study, and who would lead the studies. We have some sort of picture, but there's very little detail of context of who these people were, what the discussions actually looked like, when they took place. In this particular discussion, the Talmud says, it introduces, it says, on that day, and it goes on to say, these three rabbis had this dispute. On that day. That day is known in the Talmud for this very famous day in Talmudic literature. And that is, after the destruction of the temple, the Nasi, the leader, the head of the Jewish yeshivas, the head of the most prestigious rabbi, the chief rabbi, was Rabbi Gamliel. And he had a bit of a run-in with one of his students, Rabbi Yoshua, and eventually people lost some respect for him. They ousted him. And
Yes,
so
what? I'm sorry?
they ousted,
Right.
and they installed in his place a very young rabbi, an 18-year-old rabbi, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And this was a massive deal, huge deal. And it's a long story of how this came to be and what ended up happening. On that day, it says, Rabbi Gamliel was a very strict guy, only accepted the best and brightest to come study. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was sort of a new guard, much more accepting. It says on that day, they added 400 benches into the study hall. Now everyone's accepted and everyone's allowed to come in. So whenever the Talmud uses the phrase on that day, it's a reference to this day in Talmudic lore. So the fact that the Talmud references this discussion being that day tells us that they were discussing something related to leadership. Because it was a change of a God. It was a really important and unique moment in Jewish leadership. Installing a new rabbi, and the context, Rabbi Gamliel came from a family of people who came originally from Hillel and then from the Davidic dynasty. So Rabban means they were part of the royal family, as it were. Now they're putting in a commoner, and a young blood. It was a whole new era. So discussions on that day when the Talmud references, we are to assume that the discussions were more than just what the verse means, but there's something deep about Jewish leadership that they were playing at. So here's one idea, and this comes from a talk of the Rebbe, I think in 1988, I think. Maybe mistaken the year. And he discussed this passage, and he said something very, very deep and beautiful. So there's three models of leadership. And they're each have their place. You have a leader, all the positives, so you have obviously bad leaders. You mentioned before Hitler, you have very influential people who manage to do terrible things, right? But even positive leaders, all positive leaders bring people together, right? They create unity. And that's what happened to the Jewish people. They all sang together. There was a unified spirit. There are three modes and models of good leadership. There's a leader who is extremely, extremely influential and is a charismatic leader, and everyone just blindly follows that leader. Okay, so they have such a strong influence over people that everyone will drop whatever they're doing, whatever they think, and just follow what this leader wants, follow what this leader says. And so he has almost a ultimate, complete control and managed to bring everyone together because they're all just in awe of him or her. There's the greatest respect, and they're submitting themselves. There's a submission to this leader, and that way they're all coming together for one cause, one goal. So this leader leads through submission, through usually power, could even be influence, but it's that everyone is totally losing themselves, putting themselves aside, and just submitting to whatever this leader says. And that's signified and symbolized in this first reading of the text. Moses was the one who sang the song. The Jewish people that says, Amen, 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 right? So Moses was the one dictating their sort of spiritual experience, dictating their song, and they were just saying, yes, Moses, yes, Moses. So, yes, he unified the Jewish people, in this opinion. He got them together, he gave them this experience, but they were all just having this experience because of him. They were just in total submission to him. The next opinion in Talmud says, no, that's not great leadership. As soon as Moses leaves, it all falls apart, it crumbles. There has to be something the Jewish people had on their own, something they experienced for themselves. And so he says, yes, Moses was the one who was dictating the song, but they repeated verse by verse, which means they also internalized and recognized the values and the spiritual ideas that Moses was teaching. So it came from Moses, but then they repeated it, which means they themselves understood it. It came to be the way they thought. They recognized its truth. So they weren't just submitting themselves to Moses and saying, whatever you say, I believe you. They were saying, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I get it. I see now things the way you see them. And so Moses again influenced all the Jewish people and brought them to this elevated spiritual state. But they were actually experiencing it for themselves. They actually became changed people and now saw the world the way Moses saw the world. And this obviously is a greater degree of leadership. Not always is it possible, right? If you're a teacher in a classroom and there's a child misbehaving, sometimes there's no room to try explaining to them. The whole class is losing out. There has to be just, I said so, and therefore you have to do that, right? As a parent, there are times where you have to put your foot down because I said so. But if you always lead with that power, with the force of submission, you're not allowing your child to develop, right? You're not telling them why it's wrong, and so they never learn, they never become mature. They're just always relying on you to tell them yes, no, yes, no. The second variation, second model of leadership, you're actually telling them you have to do this, and you're telling them why, and they say, okay, now I know why. And they've learned from the experience, they've become better people. But at the end of the day, this also has its limits. Because they're only repeating whatever you tell them. The Jews repeated word for word what Moses said. When Moses is gone, they face new challenges. What are they going to do? So the third opinion says, you know what Moses' leadership was like? Which was expressed in that very first moment, that song. Moses started them off. But once Moses started the song off, the Jews on their own were able to sing it. Which means Moses provided them the tool, gave them the space, and whatever tools were needed, that they on their own could create song. They on their own could have that divine spiritual experience that burst forth with song. And that, this third opinion says, is the hallmark of Moses' leadership. And that's why at the sea, this is how the song came out. And in our own lives, as a parent, as a teacher, as whatever role it's going to be, that is also obviously the ultimate. If you're able to give the tools to your child that they then can make their own decisions. In a classroom, when you're able to educate children with values, that you see they on their own pick up what's right and wrong. They on their own recognize and take that further. You've created them with the ability to co-create, to continue creating on their own.
It reminds me a little bit of that. I don't know if it's a meme or a saying. I think it's something like, give a child a fish and he eats for one teach a child to fish in needs forever.
Forever.
Right.
Sort of like the ideal parent in some way.
So, this was the debate between these three rabbis. They weren't only concerned with the technical details of what happened at the Yam Suf, how the Jews responded to this experience, but it really went to the core of what is leadership about, what makes a great leader, and what was Moses' relationship with the Jewish people. And they all, though, agree that even the last opinion says Moses started the song. Because at the end of the day, we are mortal human beings. And no matter how great we are individually, we can never really escape our own minds. Right? You can never jump higher than yourself. No matter how high you're going to jump, that's what you are, right? So no matter how deep your thinking is and how your thinking is always you, and you're always clouded by the lens of self. So even the most altruistic act has an agenda. Because I want to be altruistic. I mean, so it's also the I. So we're stuck in our own egos, which doesn't let us really connect to God in a fuller sense. Which is why there was a need for a Moses. Moses was also human. But a prophet, someone who had a very little cloak, very little sort of resistance to his soul. So someone, a character like Moses, was able to inspire within the Jews that they should also climb out of their shells. They should also be able to reach deeper than themselves and experience God on that level. And have that experience of the sea. Which is why there's a right before this song, Az Yashir, the verse is a cryptic verse and very theologically problematic. It says the Jews saw everything at the sea, and they had faith in God and in Moses, his servant. Now, all the commentaries are immediately struck. What is faith in Moses? You're equating Moses to God. I have faith in God and I have faith in Moses. It's almost like you're believing that Moses, what is he, a demigod? He's a son of God. I have faith in Moses. And the same sentence, same breath. Faith in God, faith in Moses. Some commentaries say, and they all read it slightly differently, they have faith in God and that Moses was his servant. So it wasn't faith in Moses necessarily, but faith that Moses was his servant. But the actual wording used, Vayaminu b'Hashem u'b'Moshe, the same exact terminology in God and in Moses. And the Midrash says something fascinating. It says, these two faiths are linked. If you have faith in Moses, you have faith in God. If you don't have faith in Moses, you don't have faith in God. What does that even mean? So there's a beautiful explanation by the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Schneerson of Liadi. He has a work of Tanya. Tanya was his magnus opus. And he says, quoting from a different passage in Talmud, that there's the idea of developing a relationship with Talmidei Chacham, with scholars, with tzaddikim, with righteous people. And the Talmud says something very similar. It says, whoever has a relationship with a tzaddik, with one of these spiritual greats, is if they have a relationship with God. And he says this idea, he says, obviously in Judaism we believe that each of us has a direct relationship with God. We don't need intermediaries. I don't need someone else to be my connection to God. There's God inside of me. I have direct link to God. The problem is that it's sometimes we aren't able to recognize that within ourselves. So we have the phone line, we lost the number, right? That we are so distant, we're so caught up in our own ego, in our own self, that we don't see, I don't sense that relationship we have with God. And the idea of a tzaddik, of someone, a leader, a real leader, is able to open our eyes to who we really are. And that's expressed most in this third mode of leadership. Moses wasn't just telling people do this, do that. Moses wasn't this person who is, oh, you go to him for advice, to tell you what to do, you follow blindly. Moses is God's man. He's going to set everything straight. What do you mean God was Moses' servant? Moses was God's servant. That Moses was the one who was able to express within people their own relationship with God. And so when you have faith in Moses, when you have that relationship with Moses, then you have faith in God. Then he's able to bring out within you, he's able to show you yourself how you already have that relationship with God. So it's not that you're having faith in Moses as his own God. It means when you have a relationship with that Moses figure, with someone who lives larger than life, with that Jewish leader who's able to see through the veneer of everything around us and sense a truth in this world, then you start experiencing that within yourself as well. And so the verse continues, they believed in God and in Moses, his servants. And the very next thing is, Az Yashir Moshe. Then Moses began to sing, and the Jewish people broke out in song. Because once they had faith, quote unquote, in Moses, once they saw that in Moses, then they all were able to break out in song together. Because that impact Moses had on them, for themselves to be able to experience something much deeper.
There's some big irony here. And it's about leadership. But it's actually the unsung hero, Nachshon, that actually leads the way. Takes the first step of action. It's interesting because it's literally leading. He literally led the way into the water. It doesn't seem like he was equivocating or debating with God, what should I do? He just said, let's go. It's beyond words. Right?
So the thing with Moses raising his staff, is that just Charlton Heston and not Moses?
No, Moses raised his staff, he did.
It's with a little Cecil B. DeMille in there.
Moses, the verse speaks about Moses raising his staff. I don't
So
know
Moses
if it was...
did symbolically have God.
Yes. But it ultimately wasn't Moses performing magic, it was God doing a miracle.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
In the debates of these three, going back to the beginning of how they came to sing, was it ever thought that it could be a combination of those three arguments in some way, that there was some overlapping and that it just became one thing as a result?
It may have been. We weren't there.
Yeah.
There's no footage. Can you imagine what happened today? Everyone would be live streaming this.
Yeah, you find out
But-
there's a teleprompter with a blimp
Right.
with the words to the song. The zipper.
So we don't know. They were trying their best to read the verses, but were obviously also framing it with their own perspective of what Moses was, his role was. So they were looking at the same verse and trying to understand with technical wording, but they were coming with a perspective of what Moses' leadership signified, or what his role was in the Jews or in their relationship with God. And that colored the way they interpreted the verse. So what actually happened, none of us will know.
No, so what does tzaddik actually mean? What's
Literal
the
word tzaddik means righteous.
He's a righteous person,
Yeah.
but not necessarily a prophet.
No. No.
But Moses is a prophet. I mean, one reason you trust him is because you know that God is actually talking to him.
Yeah. Although it's another question for itself, and the commentary discusses this question. Even a prophet, you don't know if they're doing what God told them to, or telling what God told them.
That's true.
So it takes faith even to have faith in a prophet.
But if a prophet leads you out of Egypt, right, and he splits the sea, then you've got a pretty good idea.
No, so definitely he can do great things, but then the next day he can tell you his own stuff and say, God said this. Right? So even when a prophet tells you the word of God, they've proven themselves, it takes a degree of faith and trust that they're saying the truth.
Something that I've never thought about that just struck me when you were sort of telling the story of the splitting of the sea is, like, I've always imagined that moment as like all the people are in front of the sea and then like Nachshon walks in. But you know, when you were describing it, I'm envisioning people like walking through a desert. If you're driving up to the beach, you can see for a while before you get to the beach that you're about to get to water. And like, I'd always thought of it as like, they walk up and they're like, oh, there's water here. Like, there's not land, but really like this thinking of it, and like there was a journey, and for miles maybe they could see that there was water, and they were walking straight towards it, and they knew that that was the only place that they were going. And there's a certain amount of faith that you need in that portion of the journey, not just to leave and to follow what Moshe says, but to even say, like, we know that we are walking directly towards the water, and we have faith that like something's going to get figured out along the way, that once we actually get there, we'll be able to cross it.
Interesting. And then it wasn't.
Right.
They got there and it wasn't.
But like when you were sharing like the 4 or 5 different ways that people were sort of scenarios, I was like, I could imagine that being part of this sort of dialogue as people are approaching. Like, okay, well, we're still walking forward, but like, do we think we're going to have to stop there and fight the Egyptians? You know, do we think we're going to walk forward and will there be some sort of miracle and we'll just pray? Like, should we start praying now? But I think like all of those, that moment I always envisioned as one where everyone's like just walked up to the water and it's like, oh, look at, you know,
Right, hit them.
surprise. But I think like to the point of faith, and also to the point of this sort of communal inspiration, thinking about that that like slow approach to the sea is sort of like edifying to both of those. Like, one, the faith that like something's going to get figured out when we get there, and people kept walking straight. You know, they didn't like turn back. They didn't split in 2 directions. But also maybe for this like communal inspiration is like, that is also the period, like I'm sure people were celebrating when they were leaving Egypt, but like there's a moment where people see that they're walking towards water, and that like moment of reflection maybe also leads to that communal inspiration once people get to the other side.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
But Moses is at this point already fairly well demonstrated that he's a miracle worker.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
but
they must
absolutely.
have some sense that there's been no miracles for hundreds of years, and then this guy shows up and he kills all the firstborn.
He's proven himself. He's proven himself.
He is not just a righteous man, he is a...
Absolutely. But it's more than just trusting Moses. He actually, and the way we're reading this, is he actually was able to develop within the Jewish people trust in themselves, right? So he didn't just like tell them what to do, they trusted him. He actually brought out something in them. You know, a few years ago, every year there's a Kinus HaShluchim, a conference of all the Chabad rabbis around the world, and they have this dinner, massive banquet, about 5,000 people there. And there's a keynote speaker each year. And a few years ago, it was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs who spoke. And he spoke about his relationship with the Rebbe. Fascinating. He shared a story I want to share, and I'll tell you how he ended off. He was a student then in Cambridge, I think studying philosophy. And he was going around, I don't know if he had a crisis of faith or just was very curious, and he took a tour of America, going around to the greatest rabbis of the time and interviewing them, asking them questions about Judaism and faith. And he managed to get an interview with the Rebbe. And he gets there, and he says the tables were turned. Instead of me interviewing the Rebbe, he started interviewing me. He said, ask me, how many Jews are there on campus, and how involved they're in Jewish life. He says, yeah, no. And then the Rebbe said, so what are you doing about it? And he said he had no intent of becoming a rabbi or getting involved in outreach. So he started answering to the Rebbe. He says, the situation I find myself in, and the Rebbe cut him off. So he says, a person never finds himself in situations. You put yourself in situations. And he said that moment and that audience changed his whole perspective of life and literally changed his career, and he became probably one of the greatest and most famous rabbis in our time. And so he shared this story. He finished off his speech. He says, I hope I'm quoting correctly. Good leaders see in people what they seem. Great leaders see in people what they are. And exceptional leaders see in people what they can be. That was what he saw as the Rebbe. He says he didn't just see, what I seem to be or what I am, what I could be. He saw the potential in me. And he created, not only followers, created leaders. So to him, that was the hallmark of what the Rebbe was. And I think this is a lesson which we can all take with us on a personal level and on a communal level. On a personal level, we are all leaders. We're leaders in our families, leaders in our workplace, leaders in our peers. Wherever you're going, there's always forms of leadership, right? You're asking someone to pass you the ketchup, you're a leader in that little encounter, and they're following you. Obviously not a very important leadership role, but depends how much you like ketchup. But the idea is that we're all leaders in a lot of ways. And we should be leaders. We should influence people. If we have a truth, we have things we know. The Rebbe would say, if you know Aleph, teach Aleph. If you have something valuable to share, you should be sharing with people. You should be... The question is, how are we going to go about being those leaders? And it's tempting to just force our agenda on people. That's the easiest and most simplest way. Or even to, convince them. But the real leadership, real way of inspiring people, of changing people's opinions, of having impact, is to be able to lay down the tools or give people the space to be able to, on their own, come to the right decisions, on their own, realize things. And that is something we can all gain from in many areas of our life. But then, on a communal level, we look towards leaders, right? And we're all followers, and we should. We need leaders in different respects, and especially on a Jewish level, we need people to look up to, and Jews have always had leaders. And that's something we should look for in a leader, someone that's not just telling us what to do, not just forcing their agenda, but a real great leader is able to see potential in every individual. Is able to give each person what they need to create their own path, to be able to have their own prophecy, in the case it was with the Jewish people, or be able to realize their own truth, recognize their own connection with God. So, I wish to end off with a little Chaim. Start with a little Chaim, end with a little Chaim. And today we're celebrating the Rebbe's leadership. If you had the opportunity to encounter the Rebbe, I didn't personally, but if you have an opportunity to learn more about the Rebbe, and it's incredible what he did and continues to do in the Jewish community, and it's something we can all learn from, gain from, and in the spirit of what Moses was to Jewish people then, that the Rebbe didn't only challenge people to do what he wanted. The Rebbe often tell people, I'm not telling you what to do, but this is, how I see the situation. Do with it as you wish. So challenge people to be the best them they could be, and realize their own deepest connection with God. Just finish with one. We'll say L'chaim. We'll finish on one story, then we'll finish. L'chaim. Rabbi Wein Rebbe. He was the, executive vice president of the OU. Quite a well-respected rabbi. Early on in his youth, he was a young man, and he was having a bit of a crisis. He wasn't sure if he should go into rabbinics or into professions, and I think he had a bit of a crisis of faith as well. And he really had nowhere to turn. He was, a rabbi himself, young rabbi, and he just was totally at loss of direction. And someone told him, why don't you reach out to the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Crown Heights? So he called the Rebbe, and he was speaking to the secretary. And he explained the situation. He says, listen, I'm a rabbi in this town. I live in this town, that's his name, in this town. And I have a real question of faith, really important. I want to know if I can speak to the rabbi. So he hears, often the Rebbe would listen into the conversation, the secretary, and sometimes add in something. So he hears in the background the Rebbe's voice. So the Rebbe says, telling the secretary, tell him he should, there's a rabbi, a very a qualified rabbi in his town, right? A wine reb, he should consult with him. Right? And the Rebbe obviously knew who was on the phone. And he said he was taken aback. But it taught him, and it's something very, very powerful, that he had the answers inside himself. For everyone else he has the answers. For himself he also has the answers. So the Rebbe didn't tell him what to do. Didn't say this is no. But it is realize that you do have within yourself the strength, the resolve, the courage, and that depth of relationship with God. All you need to do is uncover it, discover it. It doesn't need to be created. And so that's something which we can all gain from and continue to grow. Grow as people, grow in our relationship with God, and grow. And hopefully if you all continue growing, the world continues growing in the right direction, we'll have perfected worlds. And that's what we're praying for. So, l'chaim.
L'chaim.
Chicken alone.
Tikkun olam. A perfect world. Make it a reality.
You got to take the first step.
That's right.
In Coney Island.
Toward the
Ready,
sea.
Rick? Let's go to Coney
We
Island.
have to go to Coney Island.
Right across.
The answer